Okay, do we have our attendees? Hello, this is Sean Tooley, the section president for American Planning Association in the St. Louis area. We're so grateful to have you all in attendance today. We are recording this presentation. Our presentation today will be about trust, trade-offs, and transformation, planning for community well-being, with guest speakers Katya Fels Smyth, and she'll be introducing the other guest speakers. Before we get started, I just want to remind folks that we have now published the call for sessions, the call for sponsorship for the Missouri and Arkansas State by State Planning Conference. Session proposals are due April 11th, and that conference is September 15th to 17th this year at Union Station here in the St. Louis area. Our next webinar will be in June. Detail is still yet to be determined. And before June, we'll be organizing social activities for the St. Louis Planning section. So, without further ado, Katya Fels Smyth with Trust, Trade-Offs, and Transformation.
Thank you. Now we'll do the hardest part of all of this and share the screen. Let's see if that works. Thank you so much for having us. I am really excited both for this webinar and particularly for the greater St. Louis community. I have spent a lot of time in that community over the years. It's been a really, really important partner for the Full Frame Initiative, which I will tell you a little bit about. And so it is lovely to get to spend time with you. And I also just want to acknowledge that I know that it was a really tough weekend for a whole lot of folks in the greater St. Louis region. And I hope that everybody on this webinar and your families and your constituents are safe and okay. As Sean said, thanks. I am the CEO of the Full Frame Initiative, and I'm really excited to be joined by partners from our work in Kingston, New York. Elka Gottfried will be speaking about that, as well as from the city of Cleveland, where we're also going to share with you some of that work. Keisha Chambers and Taryn Greffs are going to be sharing some of their on-the-ground work, making what I'm going to share with you really real in communities. And we're going to split up the time amongst us fairly evenly and with a couple of actionable ideas, but our hope really is that there will be questions and comments throughout, and please feel free to put the questions in the chat so we can accumulate them over time. And we will get to as many of them as we can. So without further ado, let me just tell you a little bit about the Full Frame Initiative. It's an organization that I founded more than 15 years ago as a social change organization, partnering with a really extraordinary group of government entities and communities, as well as some nonprofits and artists, who share our commitment to moving the US towards a country where everyone has a fair shot at well-being. And I am going to share with you more about what that means. But these are some of our partners here, and you can see the St. Louis County Circuit Court has been one of our great partners. The Missouri Department of Social Services is actually one of our longest planning partners. It was one of the first statewide partnerships we did. And so the work that you all do is important to us. And I'm really grateful for the work that you all are doing in the many, many communities that surround St. Louis. So what the heck do we mean by well-being? When I started Full Frame Initiative, not that many people were talking about it, and now everybody is, which I think is a great thing. And it can be confusing because folks mean lots of different things for it. So for the next hour or so, I'm going to invite you to try on a definition of well-being, and hopefully it works for you. And if it doesn't, you'll know that too. Think about well-being as the experience of feeling and being whole, individually and collectively. It turns out that that sense we get when we feel whole and full, it's not quite the same as being happy, but it's a sort of a substantial feeling. We crave that feeling because it's made up of a bunch of elements I'm going to tell you about that are essential for our health, hope, and resilience. So this understanding of well-being is so foundational that it says we are healthier, more hopeful, and more resilient when we have well-being, not the other way around. And it turns out that this feeling is not, in some sense, that complicated. It comes from having access to a set of needs and experiences in combination and balance, and they are things that you all are going to recognize. So what are those needs and experiences? I'm going to tell you a little bit about each one. We could say a lot more, and I'm happy to share more resources about this understanding of well-being. But first, we all need to feel connected, and we need to belong. We need to feel that there are places and spaces where we belong. We need to have some sense of there being some predictability in our life, some familiarity. This is really important in a spatial sense, right? I call it, can you find the bathroom in your house in the middle of the night without turning on the light, right? And how we plan so that spaces are somewhat predictable but not boring is really, really important for people's well-being. We need to experience a sense of safety, which can be different for different people. I often share that my husband, who's a foot taller than I am, doesn't worry as much about taking off his AirPods if he's walking around late at night as I do, because the world is different for a short woman late at night. We all crave a sense of mattering, right? That what we do actually has matter, and this is where we find purpose. It's also where there's curiosity. This is where if you're a dopamine junkie, you get your dopamine. It's about where we stretch goals for ourselves. And we need relevant resources, of course. We need food and shelter and clean air and water, and we need all these things. And that sense of well-being we get comes from having enough of these. We never have a perfect amount of them, but having some assets in each of these domains, not with any hierarchy. They're all interdependent. We are a lot more stable when we have connections, et cetera. And the meaning of these things matters. What makes one person feel safe may not make another person feel safe, et cetera. I'm not going to get sort of too much into the theory of it, but I want you to think deeply about, like, for yourself and for your community, that these things are the things that actually drive a lot of our human behavior and a lot of health outcomes, as well as economic outcomes and just general thriving. So that's that part of well-being that's about needs and experiences. And the combination and balance is important, and it's going to really come back when we start talking about this Wyatt tool, is this idea that we do better when we have stuff going on in a positive way in each of these domains. And most of what we do in life is just trying to get a little more connected or a little more safe or a little more stable or feel that we matter in some way in ways that don't cost us more than we're gaining, primarily in other domains. So sure, I want to be more stable, but not if it's going to cost me all my connections. I might want more food, but if it's going to be unsafe for me to do it. It's often so obvious to folks that we don't think so much about trade-offs. We certainly balance them all the time in our own lives, and communities balance them all the time. And sometimes how we think about trade-offs for other folks in our own lives, in our families, in our communities, can miss the mark a little bit. And that's where we can really end up in friction situations with communities and with others. And so what we're going to share with you is a way we can bring this understanding of well-being into planning. Not that everybody gets everything they need all the time. That's not real life. But how do we understand what people are craving and what people need? And how do we think about community growth and community opportunity and community resiliency through this lens of well-being and trade-offs in ways that also build trust with community. I also want to say why another reason we think that this is really important is, as much as this hardwiring for well-being is absolutely universal from the time we're born to the time we pass away, we don't all have a fair shot at it. And whether that is the historical, the urban renewal, or whether that is about who tends to, being older and alone in a heat wave is not a good thing, right? We are being, and where pollution is greatest and not, and who has access to clean air and water. That's not always something that is distributed fairly or well in communities and historically. And so we see differences in health outcomes, and it's not just St. Louis, and everywhere we see differences in wealth outcomes. We see differences in lots of different outcomes that are, of course, have things to do with people's individual behavior and also have to do with how we have built up around us and whose well-being has mattered in that. So how do we take all of this into consideration? Well, first, when we think about well-being, we recognize that very little of what you're often hear about well-being recognizes that people take up space. And you all are working in a field that is all about how people take up space and how much space matters to people. And so I want to thank you for that, and also just say, like, we all need to be really asserting that well-being and space have a lot to do with each other, and it's a major driver of access to well-being. And of course, you all know how much people interact in space. And so our access to sort of social infrastructure, parks and libraries and these other spatial places that people interact is a major driver of our access to well-being, and is a whole other benefit from those that is often different from how they are sort of often sold to others, right? Libraries access to information and other things, but for many people, they're the gathering place. It's the place where their kids can sit and do something while they just take a breath. It's park is a place where you can people watch, where you can be outside. It's not just about sort of access to nature, et cetera. All things you know. Within communities, within your community, within my community, within just about every community, there are things that we call well-being reservoirs. So these are places and spaces. It could be a library, it could be a park, it could be a community garden where there's very low barrier to entry and where people come and mix across lines of difference, and where people use them in ways that are greater than their intended purpose, right? So that could be that one library that really is a place of gathering and meeting for people and where people will establish routines, or where there's a particular pickup basketball game or something like that. And you have to be in a community to know about it. But the really cool thing about well-being reservoirs is that they are shock absorbers. So whether that is when there is a natural disaster like those horrible tornadoes that came through, or whether that is something sort of gentrification in a community or something else, these well-being reservoirs can really be shock absorbers in communities, places of resilience. And we haven't historically had ways of making sure that we learn enough about those systematically to be able to build on them when we're making decisions. And you in your work may know what they are in your communities. How do we engage more around that work? One of the final concepts I'm going to put on the table, it's all going to come together in this tool, is an idea called well-being stripping, which is that when we don't understand what the well-being reservoirs are in a community, when we don't understand how people are meeting their needs for well-being, we can, for the public good, be so interested in fixing something or advancing something that we inadvertently undermine or force these big trade-offs for people. Yes, there's more housing, but in the process, that well-being reservoir that was actually really important for people exchanging information and feeling tied to their community got lost. And what we've seen and documented is when there is this phenomenon of kind of well-being stripping that can happen in any community, what we see long-term is damage to people's health, damage to people's wealth, loss of quality of life. And so as we're thinking about how does planning, which is all about evolution and sort of things just continuing to move and grow, how can we do that in ways that don't contribute to well-being stripping? Well-being stripping being a phenomenon that is one of the fastest ways to erode trust with community. And often we're going into communities where that happened long before we got there, but it still feels very, very alive in people's lives. And so the way that we do this at the Full Frame Initiative with our partners, whether it's in planning or other things, is that we start with people's well-being and engage around, like, so what would it actually mean if this plan were really focused on safety and belonging and purpose of the community and of everybody in the community? And then designing and implementing with and not for. When there's a need to heal, to think about healing and regenerating, and that can be human relationships. Sometimes that's reestablishing of natural resources as well. Really thinking about how we foster community and reconnection. Thinking about who are the uncommon partners who can be brought in. I mentioned that we've worked with the St. Louis courts. Well, they might be an unusual partner to engage, but if you're in a community where their presence is pretty significant, including allies like them, and then of course building on assets and innovation instead of just assuming that it's not there. And if you are feeling like, well, that's kind of what we're already doing, I would say, great, then this framework can help you really lift up why what you're doing is really important when you may face pressures not to do it. And to the extent that there are opportunities to lean in and think differently and to try on some new pieces or to go deeper into some of this work, we hope that helps you, that this framework helps you do it. And we're going to make all these slides available afterwards, for sure. So all these different pieces, hey, we're all hardwired for well-being. We don't all have access to well-being. And some of that comes from this history of well-being stripping, which isn't always intentional. It can be inadvertent, for sure. How do we think about planning in ways that really move us forward that may be different from how and augment the best of our planning skills and tools? And particularly, how do we do it not just when we're in a great big city that may have lots of resources and things, but where we are either in a smaller community where you really are going to have to lean on other partners to develop a plan. Elka's going to share about that with Kingston, or where you are in a mid-sized city, but there is a whole lot of other stuff going on. How do we actually think about planning in ways that are really integrated with some of these other efforts, and where the surveys that we generate can gather actionable insights that can be used in other projects and in other ways? I'm going to introduce you to a tool designed to do that. It's called the Wellbeing Insights, Assets, and Tradeoffs tool, or we affectionately know it as WIAT. WIAT came about because we were approached by a part of the US Census Bureau called the Open Innovation Lab that was really wrestling with this question of what actually matters to people, right? And we know a lot about gross domestic product and other things, but what if we actually, the Census Bureau said, what if we paid attention to well-being across the country and how people are feeling about that, and how our well-being sort of assets distributed across the country? And we worked with them and said, let's narrow that a little bit for the first piece of this, and let's look particularly at built environment and infrastructure projects and say, what if we could identify ahead of time as planners what some of the downstream impacts on well-being would be and how that might get distributed? What if we had a tool to really rigorously do that so that we could adjust a project ahead of time, rather than what I think a lot of us have experienced, which is really great intent and a lot of work going into community engagement. And then it's only after the project that we hear about, or we get feedback about, or we learn about what was particularly important to the community that got lost, et cetera. How do we actually flip that script? So why it does is it's a process and a tool. It's not a sort of just sort of press a button and it spits out an answer. It functions the way it's sort of the arc of it is very similar to much of what you already do in community engagement, which is you customize and design the process. And then you go out there and you gather input using that tool and that process, and then you analyze the data, and then you adapt your plans based on it. How we do those things, I think, is worthy of a little more exploration. So I'm going to look under the hood with you for a little bit and then hand it over to leaders from 2 communities that have used WIAT for projects. So The first thing, actually, but before I go here, I will say is that one of the key parts of Wyatt is recognizing how hard it has been for a lot of folks historically to partner with communities that often are really affected by the decisions that we make. And from the community side, how hard it's been to partner with government sometimes on those same projects. And so really thinking about, gosh, how are we going to address that? And the way that we address that is with this idea of credible messengers. So the first part of designing is finding folks in community who have credibility in the different both geographic neighborhoods and or sort of demographics of the community, and particularly those that have been historically harder to reach through surveys and through other outreach segments, and bringing them in before the survey's been customized, bringing them in before the tool has been fully customized to help with that work so that it becomes really relevant to their community. As well as to just figure out a strategy for gathering that information. So really it's as a way of engaging some of the community up front, which you can begin to see has some collateral benefits, because these are folks going back into the community saying, hey, I got to be part of a process that was really different from when we were just surveyed. The tool itself that they are customizing, this is a sort of a static version of it, but it has about 15 different questions, the first part of it, that get at people's well-being. And it asks about a given project. And you're going to hear about also 2 different projects that use this at very different phases. One was, it was pretty clear what was going to be developed, and the other was at more of a conceptual phase. How do you think, how, based on what you know, does it affect your feeling of belonging, your ability to connect, et cetera? And people answer that on a Likert scale. The second part is that there are pop-ups that show up, and this is a slightly older version of it. But if someone said, my feeling that I belong here is going to get a lot worse, anything where it said a lot worse, it will pop up and ask you why, as well as anything that says it got a lot better. It will ask you why, because we know that's often where there are trade-offs, in particular a lot worse. If someone says something's going to be a lot worse, it's often because something's going to get lost. And we want to be able to know specifically what that is. And so the second part is tell us a little bit more about these things. And then the third part is demographics. Who are you? What's your role here? And what those demographic categories are is determined upfront by the city or the community, as well as the credible messengers. If you're in a community like parts of Boston or other places where there are a whole lot of students renting because there aren't enough dorms and there are a lot of sort of homeowners, that might be a question you ask. Are you a student or a renter or a homeowner? Or there might be other communities where that is a salient difference. Where for other communities, things that might be really important are generational differences or income differences or racial differences, or but just what are the different demographics where you think that people might have really, the credible messengers are helping you think about, people could have really different interpretations about and understandings and needs coming from this project. Why gathering all of that? Because it's used in 2 different ways. As the data is gathered through a technology tool, there's a back end of it that is sort of compiling it all as you go, but no one can see what actually comes out of it until this representation check comes to match. And so what you see here is that, and this is from a community that worked with us, that they had really oversampled, their sample was overrepresentative of the higher income folks in their community, underrepresented, and where it looked good, right? And it's sort of smart. It will tell you, like, work hard. If you got about 20 more folks in that middle income group, your sample will be much, much more representative. And this is really important because we all know that there are certain voices that tend to show up more at community meetings, et cetera. And that tend to respond to surveys more. I think Keisha and Taryn are going to talk about that a little bit. And so so you work hard. So sometimes you have to go back out and do more sampling, but it really is a speed bump to get everybody, the community representatives, the credible messengers, as well as the city, to say, like, nope, this isn't going to be valid unless we we have this representative sample. And that is also really important because of the message it sends to the community. No, we are serious about wanting to hear from you, and we are going to make extra effort. We're not just going to say, well, we tried. And that has been shown to really help also sort of change some dynamics. I am not going to show you what comes out of it. I'm going to leave that to the speakers who are going to share next. But from that data, and once you get to representation check, what comes out broadly is data on how a given project will influence people's access to well-being across different groups so that you can adjust and engage with the community on what would make it more worth it for you. The data is community owned. It's not owned by the city, which has been really important for a lot of folks in engaging with it, feeling like, hey, we get to own our data about ourselves. It's not just getting turned over to a government entity, and we can control that. That's really important to folks. But we also have seen really strengthened partnerships between community and government. And right now, I know that for a lot of us, that has been a stumbling block for planning in small communities and big communities for a long time. And so as this tool helps with that, we're really excited about that. And what comes out of it is that people feel it's more access and more discussion and more awareness about the importance of community well-being in ways that are not sort of pitting it completely against economic growth, which of course we need economic growth too. We need that for strong and vibrant communities. So that was sort of some concepts and an introduction to a tool. I am going to skip this part. We can come back to that just for the sake of time. I'm going to first turn it over to Elke Gottfried, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Housing Solutions and Community Initiatives, as you all can see from your screen, at a nonprofit called Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress that she can tell you a little about, as well as our work in Kingston, New York. So Elke, I will move the slides and you just tell me when you want me to.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the intro, and thank you all for being here and for having me. So as Katya mentioned, I am the director of the Center for Housing Solutions at Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress. Our organization is a regional nonprofit research and planning organization north of New York, essentially for the 9 counties north of New York City. For those of you who know the area, that's your point of reference. For those of you who may know it less, if you take a look at that map on the left, the red flag is where Kingston is. And so it's kind of smack in the middle of the mid-Hudson region that's between Albany and New York City. And the project that I'm going to share with you today is called Midtown Thriving. Midtown Kingston is the central area of Kingston. So if you look at that map on the right, Midtown is the area that connects two historic other neighborhoods. So kind of to the west of that Midtown area is called Uptown, and to the east is called the Rondout. Uptown Kingston was the original capital of New York State, and it was primarily British. And the Rondout, which is closer to the Hudson River, which is that big blue body of water on the right, the Rondout was primarily Dutch. And when the railroad came in back in industrialization times, Midtown started to really build itself out as a manufacturing and industrial hub. And because of that, as we all know, industrial uses haven't always been terribly environmentally friendly. And so like many urban areas during that time, there's a high concentration of brownfields. Next slide, Katya, if you don't mind. And for those of you who know what a brownfield is, you can check your phone for the next 10 seconds. And for those of you who don't know what a brownfield is, it's essentially a parcel of land that is either known to be or suspected to be contaminated because of a previous use. And these contaminants can be in the groundwater, they can be in the soil. They're very, very common in these formerly industrialized areas, but they certainly can pose public health risks. And more often than not, they sit there vacant for a number of years because of that contamination, is because it's very, very pricey to remediate. And so then New York State has a brownfield opportunity area study funding stream, and we got a grant for approximately $250,000 to do a planning study to assess those vacant, underutilized, potentially contaminated sites. And because we did get the grant, the city of Kingston actually agreed to take our findings and turn it into a master plan for the entire neighborhood. And so we're doing this kind of dual process where we're getting at this bigger picture, comprehensive plan for the area, and also drilling down on these specific sites in a strategic way. So next slide. So just to give you a sense of where those sites are vis-a-vis the neighborhood in general, these are some of them. Some of them are what's called Superfund sites that are already being funded for cleanup and flagged as very contaminated. Some of them are part of the voluntary cleanup program. None of this is exceptionally relevant for today, but you get the sense of the concentration. And this isn't even all of them. These are the ones that we selected under the auspices of that grant as kind of strategic development sites that we were going to work on community-led visions for those specific strategic sites based on the community input. And we were selected by Full Frame. I had been involved with Full Frame for a while before this project. Next slide, Katya, please. And so we were kind of ready to move forward with this project. And when the idea of us becoming one of the Wyatt pilot sites came up, we were very excited about it because I was already pretty well versed in the Wellbeing framework, and I knew how helpful it was. Just to give you a sense of the timeline, we are now in the middle of phase 3. So, phase 2. Phase 2 is the phase where we're starting to get into those site-specific development concepts. Next slide. Just to give you a sense, the engagement efforts that we implemented were pretty diverse. We did the formal public meetings just like any plan. We tabled at different pre-existing community events. We had small group discussions and focus groups. And then we had this public survey for which we utilized the Wyatt tool that Katya mentioned. Next. And in that survey, the first, just to give you a sense, the first thing we had in there was this vision statement that we had drafted from the findings of the focus groups that we had already led. And Katya and I were chatting before, just before this webinar, about how, there are different ways to approach a vision statement. You could have one that kind of public officials have and they want feedback on, or you could have one that is more like this, where we kind of led up to it with a lot of different conversations within the community that informed the vision statement that we put out. But we did ask people on the next slide, Katya. We did ask people if they liked it, what they liked about it, what they didn't. And even just in that question, we got a lot of nuance and feedback about kind of a mistrust in the process. They were skeptical about, again, 92% of respondents liked it, but those who didn't were actually very skeptical of, the history of mistrust with government action. This was an area that was actually elsewhere in Kingston. Kingston did experience urban renewal, and so they weren't sure that they could believe that the aspiration of that vision could actually happen. Next. The next question we asked on the survey was a top quality of life issue. And so we asked folks to choose 5 of these. And what was really interesting, next slide, is that because of the way that Wyatt supported an analysis based on different demographics, we were able to really understand different community needs. So here, for example, you can see that access to transportation and employment opportunities were highest in the age group 18 to 29, and issues like crime and activities for seniors were highest in the age group of 60 plus. And interestingly enough, the threshold for access to parks and open spaces, that older demographic actually didn't hit that that marker. And so you can kind of see the differences in those different groups. That's not to say that those groups don't find those categories important, by the way, just to make note that what this graph is showing is whether these different issues were chosen by 30% of more of respondents in each group. So this was kind of the way this is displayed is designed to show you what those top 5 issues are primarily for those age groups. Next. And here we're showing by race, ethnicity, and this offered us, quite a bit of insight as well, where the only group that the only racial demographic that exceeded the threshold for naming access to parks and open spaces as one of their top issues was a group that identified as white. And the only group that passed the threshold for feeling welcome and treated with respect was the African-American community. Of course, hearkening back to, those historic racial tensions within the city. It's still it operates as a little bit of a segregated community. And so that kind of came across in the data. And it's definitely, it's one thing if you say it, it's another thing if you show it with a graph, and it's very, very compelling to see it that way. Next. And what the Wyatt tool, and I kind of wish that I had the survey questions to show you what led to this, but the results of the assessments of how people felt new development would impact their well-being. You can see the green bars essentially show you a sentiment that's positive. The gray shows you a sense of a neutral, no response, and the red is kind of a negative sentiment about different issues. And so the question that we asked here was based on the following criteria, how will new commercial and residential development in Midtown Kingston impact your well-being? And then there were a series of 17 questions where the different domains of well-being were touched upon through those questions. And so just as an example, the group of respondents that identify as Hispanic or Latino were actually the most positive about potential new development. And if you go down to, get down to the bottom, between 5 and 10, folks who have lived in Kingston between 5 or 10 years were actually the most negative about potential new development. And so it's just interesting to see, based on your different demographic, how your responses are going to be different. But again, overwhelmingly, the response was positive. Now, on the next slide, you'll be able to see one of the specific domains of well-being is safety. And when you take a look down near the bottom, the group that expressed the most negative sentiment to new development was lifelong residents. And so 19% of lifelong residents had a negative response to impacts of new development on their sense of safety. And what this indicated to us was that we actually have to have more conversations with lifelong residents focused on these specific issues that they identified as potential threats. So obviously the results of the survey are not the final, okay, now we can make our recommendations, but what it does do is it really indicated to us where we had a lot more digging to do and where the pain points might be, so that we can mitigate some of those perceived threats long term. Next. So the top themes, and this is, I think, maybe my last slide, maybe my 2 last slides, but just to give you a sense of what kind of insights we gleaned from this process. There were 5 key themes. The first was keeping things local. This was kind of reflecting severe fears of gentrification and displacement. Kingston during the pandemic was actually the area where housing prices increased most rapidly in the entire country during the pandemic. So what one may call the hottest real estate market in the country during the pandemic. And so that was really very fresh. And people are continuously being priced out of their neighborhoods there. And so that's definitely something that we were made aware of. Housing done right was kind of related to that, where there was this tension between community and outside interests, who's doing the development, who benefits from it. And again, affordable housing that is permanent rather than, potential expirations of subsidies. There was a lot of interest in cooperative ownership, community land trusts, things like that. The local business and economic health obviously it was also, again, related, kind of this focus on local small businesses. Venues to gather is kind of straightforward, with a strong focus on free gathering spaces, just places where people can, with the loss of third places. Katya mentioned well-being stripping in her presentation, and we did ask a question in the survey, what would you miss most if it were gone? And people actually mentioned also what's already gone that they already miss. And there were even just the Dunkin' Donuts closed, and that was where our kids could go after school to hang out before we pick them up, that kind of thing that's inexpensive, that you don't have to necessarily spend money to gather and hang out. And then lastly, and I touched upon this a little bit earlier, was this need for more transparency and accountability in the process from the municipality, a need to nurture those relationships between the government agencies and the community. Next slide. So lastly, just a few of the lessons we learned from Wyatt. The Wellbeing framework itself, I've found exceptionally helpful, especially in, we work in a lot of communities where, it's politically very diverse, and it really allows us to speak in a language that brings people together rather than fueling divisions. And that's extremely helpful. It's hard to argue with well-being as kind of a motivator for all of us. And so that's been really inspiring to us and helpful. The ways that we learned from Wyatt and the nuances that we could glean actually did refocus our existing conditions, which is a big deal because, for those of you who are working in planning, a lot of the times you just have a laundry list of data. We're going to look at housing, we're going to look at economic this, we're going to look at, whatever it is. You pull the data from the census, you dump it into a page. And we really shifted that. We incorporated the feedback throughout our data analysis, and it did shift us from that laundry list specifically to the economic and housing data that either supported or dispelled some of the community concerns. And so we were able to use that data in a way that was very relevant to what the community was telling us. Of course, the credible messengers were, that nurtured new relationships and engagement with people who formerly may not have been or may not have felt like City Hall was a place that they could approach. And so that was new. And even the staff who we work with at City Hall have mentioned that those relationships have been very beneficial for them, and to make sure that they have better relationships with community members. People said, some people said the survey was too long and they didn't bother filling it out, but for those that did, and that was, again, almost 350 responses, they felt like, oh, you really want to hear what we're saying. This isn't just a survey to check off a box. It was really deep. Now, the next project that you're going to hear about was more focused on a specific project, whereas ours was kind of more in the planning phase. And I think because it was in the planning phase, people felt that the questions we were asking were a little vague because they didn't really know, what is it exactly that you're going to be doing here? And the truth is we didn't know yet. And that's why we're asking you now, early on in the process. It was a little tricky to get at that issue, but ultimately I think the results were very, very meaningful. And we're even using it in another project. I'm sitting here in the town of Shandaken, which is in the Catskill Mountains. I'm about to have a public meeting tonight to analyze the survey results from a survey we just did that was very much inspired by the Wellbeing framework. So we're really carrying it through a lot of our work now that we've done that Wyatt process. That's it. Katya, I think this is back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elka, for that. These are actually quotes from folks who participated in the Kingston process. The blue are from city and planning folks, and the pink are from residents. And there were a lot more we could have included, but the type would have been too small. Working with Kingston was an amazing opportunity for the Full Frame Initiative too. Taught us a lot about how we do Wyatt. There are just a couple of points that Elka made that I want to just really underscore. One is you can see from the data that what this process allows us to do is to really, we all know that community isn't one thing, and yet I find myself, many of us find ourselves talking about the community wants, the community thinks, the community. And what this process and tool does is for everybody, planners, but also residents, to see like, there is diversity of thought and opinions in our community, and we have to wrestle and hold with that. So it can get us a little bit out of that binary of a couple people speaking for the community and the city hearing, having heard from other folks and wanting to do something else. It appropriately sort of complexifies that tug of war that can happen, and ways that also can help folks like younger residents feel heard, knowing that we need to be building so that people want to stay in our communities and can stay in our communities. But those are folks that often don't feel heard. And that feeling seen, I think, is also really, really important. Both Kingston and Cleveland and other places, the sharing back of this data and the sense making, which I think you're going to hear more about from Cleveland, is a really, really important way that people feel seen. The final thing I want to say, and I think our folks from Cleveland will also carry this thread forward, is Elka mentioned just quickly at the end the work in Shandaken, where they aren't doing Wyatt formally, but they're taking what they learned. Some of these concepts about how you partner with community, the idea of well-being, how you can ask questions differently, and folding that into their process. And for the Full Frame Initiative, that is so exciting. We are not an organization that exists to get people to do a tool. We are really interested in helping people and communities build their capacity to see each other and interact in ways that make each other whole. And so if Wyatt is a sort of a way to try on some of that thinking that can move on beyond Wyatt, or you can do Wyatt on other projects, that is success. And so if what you take from this presentation is, I'm not sure we can do this whole Wyatt thing, but I'm interested in that credible messenger idea, or I'm interested in that well-being stripping idea, that's fabulous. And we'd love to hear from you. I'm now going to turn it over to two amazing partners from Cleveland. Cleveland was the first Wyatt site, and I don't want to discount that. It takes a lot of bravery to say, not only do we want to try a new tool and process, we want to try something that is getting at different questions, a different way to think about things. They leaned into it incredibly hard and have stayed amazing partners with us as we have learned and through the process. So I'm really excited to introduce Keisha Chambers, who's from the City of Cleveland's Mayor's Office of Capital Projects, or MOCAP, and Taryn Gress from Neighborhood Connections, which was the intermediary that helped connect with and sort of organize and help with the payments to credible messengers, which we haven't talked about, but we could talk about it if there's interest in Q&A.
You ready?
The floor is yours.
Yep. Hello. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, everybody, for having us here. My name is Keisha Chambers. I'm Assistant Director of the Mayor's Office of Capital Projects. And the whole concept of Wyatt, it appeared on my desk one day, which is now I'm so grateful for. And it was an opportunity to work with Full Frame Initiative on bringing in the Wyatt tool. We were pretty much in the middle of public engagement for our North Coast Connector project. And this project already had our values in place. We already had our primary needs and secondary needs in place. So we, as Katya said, we were really coming in at the middle of this effort and incorporating some of those Wyatt tools. So we already had a vision in place. So unlike Kingston, the community didn't have an opportunity to, contribute to forming the vision, but our mayor set forth a very strong vision that made sure that we were guided in our steps using racial equity, economic opportunity, and climate resiliency as our primary focus on rolling out this project. And when we're looking at our needs, it's all around equity, making sure that people are able to access the lakefront, giving opportunities for pedestrians and bicyclists to travel along our roads. But primarily in our second needs section, it was to foster equity of lakefront access. And in a lot of communities, if there's a lake there, you just assume you'll be able to have access. But unfortunately, here in Cleveland, and not just for our lakefront, but even really our river, the Cuyahoga River, access to our water bodies has been dominated by industrial practices. So a port or the railroads, just highways have really dominated those spaces. And so our charge was to make sure that people could connect with those spaces, and also to just kind of reshape our infrastructure. So Katya, can you go to the next slide, please? I want to give them a visual of this. So this is the Brown Stadium. So I'm sure everybody's familiar with our football team for a variety of reasons, but that is where they play football. And as you see behind them is a parking lot. And those buildings that are there now have actually kind of moved on the other side, but it's just an open parking lot. Great opportunity for people to have access to the lakefront, but right now it just sits idle, only used to park a few cars during football games. And also another concept of this project is how to get people over to this space. So we are also looking to build a land bridge to make this connection. So our overall goal and what we were doing a master plan for, and Katya, you can go to the next slide, is to make this space look like and have amenities where people can come and maybe sit on benches, do the walking path. There's sports courts and playgrounds and just open fields for kite flying and just a variety of different programming and features that we like to put on this space. So this is the master plan that we've created for this space. And it also includes, as I mentioned before, changing our highway to a boulevard, creating more spaces for bicycles and pedestrians. So we really had made some progress already on looking at our different planning and design options for this space. But when we were presented with Wyatt, and looking at the data that we'd already collected, we realized we were missing some opportunities. So we can go to the next slide, because that opportunity is really addressing the disconnect. And the disconnect is what creates this inequality that we currently have with our communities being able to access the lake. This graphic is just showing you that there's a lot of blocks, where you see the red circles, that's where access points have been cut off because of a highway. And then there's also the railroad, as I mentioned before. So there's very limited access points. And when you are able to gain access, it kind of leads to almost nothing. There's just really no major programming in this space. So if we have this disconnect and we want to change it, we need to make sure that we are addressing all of, this is a citywide issue, so we need to make sure we're addressing everyone. Next slide. And so when we were first doing the surveys around this project, and we were doing meetings at different locations, opening up City Hall, the mayor was addressing the constituents, and we thought we were really making some significant impact. And these numbers here kind of show you what the information, who we were receiving the information back from. And then that's when we realized, well, we are mostly hearing from a mostly white audience. We are also mostly hearing from people of a certain income. We're hearing from people that have specific reasons for visiting the space. Like, for instance, they're out of town, or they're coming to eat at restaurants, or special events, which all are typically activities that are expensive. Going to a sports event, going to a Browns game is very expensive. So we know we're not reaching just our all of our constituents. In our first pass, we were reaching a very select and specific audience. We wanted to make sure that we could broaden that. Can you go to the next slide, please? So why it helped us to see what that opportunity was going to be to broaden our demographic. So they gathered the data for us, and that we already had, and they inputted it into their current system, and it really showed us where we were missing our constituent input, where our gaps were. And those gaps were on East Side, which is the green, which is the majority Black community, which is Ward 5, and also the West Side, which is the, I guess that's a brown orangey color, which is a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. So we realized that we were missing these key demographics. And in addition, we had a large demographic or data gap for our youth and our elderly in incomes less than $50,000. So why it thus became the tool that we used to try to make sure that we captured these voices. Next slide. So we were going from a space, if you saw, we would disconnect, and we are trying to then reconnect with the community through the wide approach. And this approach helped us to just value the input. We wanted to exhibit the effort to gather input, because we knew if we showed the constituents that we were interested in what they were going to give us and tell us, and they saw that we were receiving it and applying it, that we could then build some trust and healing with the communities. Incredible Messengers was just an absolute new approach for us to extend this effort. Typical public engagement for us was to maybe piggyback on the back of a council person's meeting, or schedule just a random time to go maybe to a library or a recreation center and bring our boards, and set our boards up and talk about a project, and then expect people to be able to just ask us questions or give us comments back, just based on that one point of contact. And oftentimes we would take whatever they shared with us, and we would just go, we just go and do what we're going to do with the project, and we don't circle back to our constituents. So better understanding Wyatt and the information that we needed to receive also helped us to see the major inefficiencies and gaps in how we are delivering information to our constituents. So the Credible Messengers, I think, are an awesome tool, because they are already the neighbors, community members in our project areas, and they're able to go out and talk directly to our constituents in more conversational approaches, to be able to find out different information about our project. So we helped to create the surveys. We had specific questions that we wanted to pull from our constituents around what they wanted to see in the space, if something was able to happen. But we also, in an effort to make sure that we were addressing any past harms that were done by disconnecting the communities from the lake, or any other harms as far as not feeling comfortable when they went to the lake, or just any other incidents that might have happened in their experiences. We had questions that gave them an opportunity to express that. We wanted to capture that and make sure that was a part of the history of this project. And as we are continuing to develop this plan, we just want to make sure that we show and that we felt their stories and we want to contribute to their healing. And maybe there's some ways we can apply some of the things that we've learned, and maybe some artwork, and making sure we have, a variety of benches. And we've created this whole porch concept around people feeling that they are welcome, come onto our porch. So these are just concepts and ideas we've gotten just from having conversations. And the Credible Messengers really helped us to pull that information and pull those stories out of the surveyors. And so now, as we were putting forth and creating these questions, we also knew that we needed to frame them from a perspective of well-being. So it's important that you ask the question in such a way that people feel like they can share that information with you. And this process, I think, also helped to inspire civic advocacy. And Elka kind of said that same phrasing before, like this inspires people to be a part of the community, because oftentimes, and we did hear this repeated, oh, somebody came and they told us that this would happen, and then it never happened. And if that happens continuously, then they don't trust the process. And so as we continue to go to them wanting information, then they don't feel like they're being heard. They don't feel like their information is captured and taken back. We're not updating them on progress, because oftentimes these projects take a long time. And so they feel disconnected because they just hadn't heard anything from us. So this also, encourages civic advocacy, because now people are learning and understanding our processes and understanding that this isn't just a one-time touch, but, we'll be back and we will continue these conversations. So after, we applied this wide approach, used the Credible Messengers to go out into the community, then we started to see some different results. And we can go to the next slide. So this helped us to, refocus our connections. I'm really playing up on our connection theme here, because this then helped us to refocus the connections that we wanted to reach out to. In our initial public engagement efforts, we had a sample size of about 4,000. So we really thought we were doing great. But as I showed you before, we were getting 4,000 of the same voices. So when we were able to refocus using the Wyatt tool and our Credible Messengers, our sample size was very specific to the audiences that we needed to reach. So we reduced it to 361, but we were able to then, get a 35% participation from African Americans, 49% from Hispanic and Latinos. We were able to capture the age groups that we were seeking to get more information from. And we were able to make sure that we reached out to household incomes that were less than 50,000, those voices that don't usually get to be heard for these major infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. So once we got all that information, it kind of solidified how we needed to move forward with well-being and incorporate these activities into what we do with public engagement. So we are now in the process of, expanding the lens of well-being across our public engagement efforts. And also, using them on a variety of projects. In MOCAPs, we do roads, we do sidewalks, we do facilities. So how can we take this well-being concept and apply them to a different variety of projects? And then making sure that as we work with departments, that they understand that this is a lens that we're using as we're doing our public engagement, and to bring them into this concept as well. Another part of well-being is the language. How do you talk and address your constituents when you're talking to them, so they can also understand that you are employing this kind of different approach and trying to seek their well-being. So we are also making sure that, just our language change. It'll be a complete culture change to what we've always done with engagement, to moving forward to one with the well-being lens. And then making sure we team with community organizations. And as you mentioned, you'll hear from Taryn, who has been our key partner in this, and identifying those community organizers for us, and scheduling the trainings and organizing with them and staying in contact with our community and our credible messengers, which helps them feel like they're a part of this process. And that's just admittedly something that, in our day-to-day work, we don't have the capacity to do. So it's really great to have a community organization in place that we can work with. And then how can we, then take this data, which is another key thing with Wyatt is, as we gather the data, share the data. And, we have tools through our city GIS process. We have a whole open data platform where we can start sharing the data that we collect. So community members, as they need data for whatever efforts they are trying to take on within their community, they have it available for them. And as we are, moving forth with applying for grants or any other kind of funding, it's great to have those data sets available for use. And then the next slide, I think, just closes out with some just some scenes from our engagement and the efforts and just the attention that people have given to this effort. And it has definitely made the community connections closer, because I happened to see one of our credible messengers in church one day, and it was just amazing to have that that connection be born out of these efforts. So thank you very much. Taryn is coming on now to speak about how her organization really helped and supported our work.
Thanks, Keisha. Hi, everyone. I'm Taryn Gress. I'm the Director of Impact at Neighborhood Connections, and we are a grassroots community building organization, and we have run a small grants program in Cleveland and East Cleveland for over 20 years. So when Wyatt, the idea of Wyatt was kind of being discussed at the city level, they knew that there was going to be, they needed a trusted community organization that could be that liaison between residents and the work we were doing with Wyatt. And so the director of planning at the time reached out to our director to see if this would be something we would be interested in. And we're always interested in ways that we can connect community members that we're working with to city processes or processes they may not be connected to before. And we just have many people we're connected with. And so here on the slide, you can see, so the distribution of funds is something that we do regularly. And we act as a fiscal sponsor for a range of groups. So those who receive small grants from us either find their own fiscal sponsor, and then we sometimes act as a fiscal sponsor for grantees, but more often it's for other groups who are trying to do work and don't have their own 501c3. So we're able to distribute funds quickly and connect with people directly. And our strategy is a network-based strategy. So it's a combination of asset-based community development and community network building. So we're constantly connecting with a variety of groups and partners kind of focused on residents first, and kind of what are the gifts and contributions that those in their community have, and elevating those, and then connecting those people with the resources they may need to move on anything that they want to. So we were excited to take on something new, which none of us had been familiar with this before. My background had been in community-based research at Case Western Reserve University in their social work school. So I had a sense of, yeah, this sounds great, and also seems like a really interesting way to get surveys, which people are not always as interested in taking. And so the credible messenger component of it, of having someone that ask you to do a survey, seemed like it would end up with a higher success rate, which it did. So that I was interested in that part of it too. Do you want to go to the next slide? Oh, maybe not. Oh, Katya disappeared. Yeah, that's okay. I don't necessarily need the slide, but some of the key takeaways for us were as Elka mentioned, we were able to connect with some folks that we had not connected before, particularly in Ward 14. A lot of our grant making over the years has been more on the east side, in part with intentionality, in part people knowing about our grant making. And so with the kind of distribution of the needing to focus on these two areas of the city that demonstrated where there was lack of participation in the previous community engagement efforts, it was an opportunity for us to get to know some folks that we hadn't necessarily connected with before in Ward 14. And so I'd cite that that was something really positive for us. And then just coordinating with the city. I think our organization is very familiar with certain components of the work of the city, but we are kind of coincidentally, we're going to be about to be working more in depth with the Mayor's Office of Capital Projects, which we are now, on their community engagement, how they approach community engagement and public engagement. In city planning was also beginning a process where they're kind of thinking differently about how they approach community engagement and public engagement. And so the combination of all of us having experienced this Wyatt process together, I think has helped those groups carry on that framing of well-being and how we're thinking about the role, especially of the credible messengers, and how having a group of people who are well versed in what's going to be happening with a project, that they can then communicate that, or essentially like translate that to the everyday person around, gets a lot more buy-in and interest from the community. And then doing that work on the front end really means that there's less pushback or less kind of concern on the back end when the plan is finally rolled out. And so in this case of the North Coast work, that work is has been funded. So we didn't know going into the Wyatt process, like, would all this funding come together? And it really has now. And so it's been a great opportunity to say, like, your contributions really led to this thing that is going to be happening, and we'll continue to work with you on it. Yeah, and then, so just in terms of our role, so is the kind of connecting, getting in touch with the credible messengers, asking them if they wanted to be part of this process, kind of asking them to take a little bit of a leap of faith, and we didn't quite know exactly what it is, but because of their trust with the organization, they were willing to try it out, and then being able to pay them efficiently. So I think we paid them weekly. I would say if I did it again, I might go to bi-weekly since it ended up being a bit of a administrative just more work on my end, but I think they really appreciated it. And then they also talked with us about some experiences they had in previous planning processes where some of them didn't feel like they were well compensated, or there was some agreement about what they'd be committing to, and it ended up going over that. And so that was helpful perspective for us getting into it, to just say, like, we'll have to communicate with each other about expectations of time and energy along the way. And then the credible messengers just like logistically used tablets. So there was an option of doing a paper survey. They also used tablets that FFI had provided, but we helped them kind of get oriented with them and coordinate the checking in and checking out of them. So I think that might be, okay. Yeah, just kind of why is this process different? As I mentioned, the payment and compensation. So people were fairly compensated for their time. And Ebony here was talked with her about like what would be fair, what's been your experience. She was the one who had said, I've had experiences in other planning processes and would like to make sure that it's really going to be worth my time, and just in emphasizing that community members' perspectives is very valuable, and that it should be fairly compensated. And then neighborhood connections, we have an office that allowed for the we have a lot of conversations here. Our space is set up to have community conversations, so we were able to host the trainings, and felt like it was really kind of just building upon our approach, which is very relational, and then also emphasizing to community members that the data would be owned by them, and that they would be co-owners in the process, and that all of that really was true throughout. And then what we did a sense-making session in March of 2020, like so this time last year. And then a couple of our credible messengers have since presented on their experience with either someone from MOCA. I think with Keisha, I don't know if they've presented with you, but they have with another person who was on our team from the planning department, Dan Schinkel. So they presented with him at other APA conferences. I think it was in Indianapolis, and then one locally, a local one, the Ohio chapter. So they've been able to share their experience and how positive it's been. And then Dan has talked about how it's shifted his, as he's taking on other planning processes, it's shifted how he approaches the work. So thinking about the different groups of people that they're reaching, like, are we reaching the senior population? If we're not, then maybe we should go to a senior building, have this conversation rather than expecting people to come to us. So I think making it the well-being framing and then the direct experience with Wyatt has really helped shape how we're thinking, how we as Neighborhood Connections, but the city departments are thinking about how we approach community engagement and public engagement, and what's valuable to everyone, and what's really going to be ending up in well-being for all of us. I think that might be it.
I think that is, yeah. I will stop sharing, and thank you, Erin and Keisha, for presenting and for your work. And we have a few minutes for questions. If folks have questions for the, I guess, put them in the chat. Is that right, Sean? We'll just go off the chat if there are any.
Yes.
Comments? I know we shared a lot of information with you because we're all pretty enthusiastic about this. Oh, it looks like there's something. How do you plan for, in proposals and budgeting, having to revisit an engagement boost in order to get the representative sample? That's a great question.
How do we plan for a budget?
I think the question is sort of, okay, so if the first round of engagement doesn't give you that representative sample, where does the money come to go back out for more? And I can give, why don't you guys give the answer from the city, and I will give the answer from sort of FFI's perspective.
Yep. So for us, fortunately, we had started the master plan work. So we were able to combine the engagement that we had done from our lakefront connector to our master plan work. And the master plan had some public engagement funding in it, and we still had some from our connector project funding. So we kind of married the two and it had a bigger budget and just really expanded and boosted our public engagement from there.
Yeah, I can speak to our budget had some unique aspects to it as well. The Brownfield program in New York State very heavily focuses on community engagement. So our engagement budget was fairly significant to begin with. But what we didn't plan for was having and paying credible messengers. It wasn't, when we started the project before Full Frame joined us. And so the city had some leftover ARPA money that they allocated specifically to pay the credible messengers. So that's one thing, that, again, it's unique to our circumstances. But I think in general, planning a buffer to what you think you're going to be doing is just how to roll. If you don't have those luxuries of, leftover pockets of money.
Yeah, and we also got some private funds to pay the credible messengers. So, and then I kind of figured out based on the hourly rates that we agreed to with them, like how many hours they could spend and likely how many surveys that would mean, and tried to go from there. But we did have private funding from a local foundation to pay them, which was really helpful.
I would add to that, that, you know, as Cleveland showed, right, I think you get that, you definitely are going to get that bump if the first wave is very much hearing from the folks that you know you're going to be able to get, even if you don't do credible messenger outreach. So one way of really thinking about it is to be really clear about what communities you need credible messengers from. The folks that you're already generally hearing from, you probably don't need credible messengers there. And so to really target as much as you can, like, right, to sort of look at where your least representation tends to come from, if you know, and to really sort of focus there. And then, as Elka said, to put a buffer in. We haven't been doing this collectively for that long, but I'm really encouraged by the fact that in both Cleveland and Kingston, there is this sort of sense of, it wasn't just a blip that the credible messengers and others were sort of involved, like something begins to shift, and that hopefully it becomes over time, there's value in repeating this kind of process. So the more that communities see themselves reflected in the data, the less likely it is that you're going to have to go out and resample to get folks in. So I also think that there probably is thinking about some of this as if this is a shift you want to make in your community. Like, there is going to be more of an upfront investment. The first couple of times that you are doing surveying and really paying attention to representation, folks are going to stand back and say, are they serious about it? But the more you do it, the easier it's going to get.
I think
Thank
we
you.
do have one more question.
How often do you find that a city has been doing its own engagement prior to any planning efforts? At times, we find that there's a lot of expectation on a particular planning effort to do, quote unquote, all the engagement when it really needed some early work from the city. Who wants to take that one? From FFI's standpoint, I think we tend to see communities that feel like they've been over-surveyed. And so often, as someone mentioned, may have even stopped showing up or stopped responding. And so there is this, like, we haven't been well engaged, and yet sort of everything should shift. But Taryn, it looked like you had
Well,
answer.
I guess, and you know, Keisha, these two processes that I was mentioning, like the city, I think is aware of a need for improvement or shift in how they think about doing community engagement as part of all of their either the capital projects or planning projects. And so I think that you know, it seems like there's some intentionality now that I haven't, you know, I've only been clued in for a little while, but that's maybe not, and I think that's from, you know, some learning. I don't know from Wyatt necessarily, or if you were, I think that was in the works a couple of years ago. It just took some time to get going with it, but that there's been an acknowledgement that, the one singular planning process can't take care of all of the engagement from the city.
Elka, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I couldn't tell if Keisha was.
No, I feel like the question was about the city, so I'm not the one to speak on what the city does. So.
I mean, the truth is, I think every city struggles to, and this is having been a city planner embedded in a municipality. Cities in general are struggling with deteriorating civic engagement and trust in democracy, right? And so that's no matter who you are. I'm talking very broadly. And so I think, you know, the question really hits on a much broader question that I know in our recommendations and through our projects, we are going to relate to the need for the city to invest more regularly in developing those relationships and coordinating with these organizations that are competing over resources rather than collaborating, and what are the steps the city can take in order to nurture those relationships. It's almost like we're doing these physical plans about the built environment when cities also really need strategic plans for coordination citywide between the municipality and community organizations and citizens, like residents themselves, right? So as much as we can, we do kind of try to identify where those points of intervention might be for the city and include those in our master planning recommendations.
And Kingston, actually, we started the Wyatt process with an exercise called Broken Promises, which was really trying to a facilitated process for bringing into the room some of the history of communities feeling like there had been broken promises before, which I think some of that expectation that all the engagement is going to happen in one process, at least from the community side, can come from often a pent-up feeling of we have to be seen, feeling heard. And so it can set a sort of also tone of like, we're not going to be able to do all of this all in one process. We're not going to be able to get over the distrust. We're not going to be able to get all the answers. And I see the final question about data ownership, and I know we're out of time, but that's a more complicated question. So you are welcome to reach out to us, and we would love to talk to you more. But anybody.
Thank you all for your presentation today. This has been most helpful to our APA section. The webinar will be posted on the St. Louis section of the APA's YouTube account, where it's freely available, where folks can watch it. We very much appreciate all of our speakers today, especially that this has been lifted up by the American Planning Association as a planning service report as new methods for how we can improve engagement and community well-being. Thank you all so much for your time and contributions today.
Thank you
And this
so
will
much.
be available for continuing maintenance credits for AICP credentialed planners.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you.